Before we begin, make sure you have your guided notes ready so you can follow along with the lecture. In this lesson, we're going to focus on the global economy during the interwar period, which is the time between World War I and World War II. This period is important because it helps us understand how economic instability can shape political decisions, influence societies, and contribute to major global conflicts. As we move through the lesson, think about how economic problems, like inflation, unemployment, and financial collapse, don't just stay within one country. Instead, they often spread and have global consequences, affecting governments, populations, and international relationships. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain how economic challenges during this period contributed to broader instability around the world. Our learning objective is to explain how different governments responded to economic crisis after 1900. Following World War I and the Great Depression, governments began to take a more active role in economic life. The Soviet Union controlled its national economy through the five-year plans, which often implemented repressive policies. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, officially ended World War I, but it also created serious economic challenges, especially for Germany, that would have long-lasting consequences. One of the most significant parts of the treaty was the requirement that Germany accept full responsibility for causing the war. This is often referred to as the War Guilt Clause, and it justified forcing Germany to pay massive reparations to the Allied powers. These payments were intended to cover the cost of war damages, but they placed an enormous financial burden on Germany's already struggling economy. To meet these obligations, Germany had to send large sums of money and resources out of the country, which limited its ability to invest in rebuilding its own economy. At the same time, Germany also lost key territories, including regions like Alsace-Lorraine and parts of Prussia. These areas were not only important for national pride, but they were also economically valuable, containing natural resources like coal and productive agricultural land. The treaty also imposed strict military limitations, reducing Germany's army and eliminating conscription. While this was meant to prevent future conflict, it also had economic consequences by reducing jobs and weakening industries connected to military production. Additionally, restrictions on trade and the loss of Germany's merchant fleet made it harder for the country to participate in international commerce, which had previously been a major source of wealth. When you combine all of these factors, reparations, territorial losses, military restrictions, and trade limitations, you can see how the Treaty of Versailles didn't just end the war. It created economic instability that made recovery extremely difficult and set the stage for future crises. One of the most dramatic economic crises Germany experienced after World War I was hyperinflation, which reached its peak in 1923 and had devastating effects on everyday life. Hyperinflation occurs when prices increase extremely rapidly, often because there is too much money in circulation and not enough goods to support it. In Germany's case, this crisis was largely the result of the government attempting to deal with the financial pressures created by the Treaty of Versailles. In order to make reparations payments and cover domestic expenses, the German government began printing large amounts of money. However, printing more money without increasing production does not create real economic value. Instead, it reduces the value of the currency. As more money entered circulation, the German mark lost its value at an incredibly fast rate. This caused prices to rise dramatically, sometimes doubling, in just a matter of days. By 1923, the situation had become extreme. People needed wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy basic goods like bread. Workers were often paid multiple times a day, so they could spend their wages before prices increased again. Savings that individuals had built up over years were wiped out almost overnight, particularly devastating the middle class. This crisis also led to a loss of confidence in both the government and the economic system. When people no longer trust their currency or institutions, it creates instability that goes beyond economics and begins to affect politics and society as well. So hyperinflation was not just about rising prices, it fundamentally disrupted daily life and contributed to the broader instability of the Weimar Republic. This slide gives you a visual representation of just how extreme hyperinflation became in Germany by 1923, and it helps us move from understanding the concept to actually seeing its impact. As inflation worsened, smaller denominations of money quickly became useless. Bills that once could buy everyday items were no longer enough to purchase even basic necessities. In response, the German government began printing larger and larger denominations of currency in an attempt to keep up with rapidly rising prices. What you see on this slide are examples of that shift. Currency moving from thousands to millions to billions of marks. The fact that the government had to print money in the billions is a clear sign that the value of the currency had essentially collapsed. For ordinary people, this created an almost unimaginable situation. Instead of carrying a few bills, people needed stacks of cash just to buy something simple like bread. In some cases, the cost of goods would increase so quickly that by the time someone was paid, their wages had already lost significant value. Because money was becoming so unreliable, some people turned to bartering, trading goods directly instead of using currency. Others rushed to spend their money as quickly as possible before it lost even more value. This slide is important because it shows that hyperinflation wasn't just an abstract economic issue. It completely disrupted daily life, making it difficult for people to survive, and further eroding trust in the government and financial system. To really understand Germany's economic situation in the interwar period, we need to look at how its economy changed over time between 1918 and 1929. This wasn't a steady recovery, it was a series of dramatic ups and downs. Immediately after World War I, Germany was in a very weak position. The country was dealing with the physical and financial costs of the war, along with the burden of reparations imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. Unemployment was high, industrial production had slowed, and there was widespread social and political unrest. Many people were struggling to meet basic needs, which added to the instability of the new Weimar Republic. This instability eventually contributed to the hyperinflation crisis of 1923, which we just discussed. During this period, the value of the currency collapsed, wiping out savings and further damaging confidence in the government. However, after 1923, Germany entered a period of relative recovery. One major step was the introduction of a new, more stable currency, which helped restore confidence in the financial system. In addition, international agreements like the Dawes Plan restructured Germany's reparations and brought in loans from the United States, providing much-needed financial support. As a result, the mid to late 1920s became known as the Golden Twenties, a time when industrial production increased, cultural life flourished, and living conditions improved for many people. But this recovery was fragile. It depended heavily on foreign loans and did not fix deeper economic problems. That meant when the global economy collapsed in 1929, Germany was especially vulnerable. The Great Depression, which began in 1929, was the most severe global economic crisis of the interwar period, and its effects were felt far beyond the United States. The event most commonly associated with the start of the Great Depression is the stock market crash in October 1929. During this time, stock prices in the United States fell dramatically, wiping out billions of dollars in wealth. Many investors had bought stocks on margin, meaning they had borrowed money to invest, so when prices collapsed, they were unable to repay their debts. This triggered a chain reaction throughout the economy. Banks that had invested in the stock market or loaned money to investors began to fail. As banks collapsed, people lost their savings, and businesses that depended on loans were forced to shut down. As businesses closed, unemployment increased rapidly. With fewer people earning income, consumer spending declined, which caused even more businesses to fail. This created a downward economic spiral that was difficult to stop. What makes the Great Depression especially important is that it quickly became a global crisis. The United States had been providing loans to countries like Germany, so when the US economy collapsed, those loans dried up. This caused economic problems to spread across Europe and beyond. Additionally, countries responded by raising tariffs, such as the Smoot-Hawley tariff in the United States, which reduced international trade and made the global situation even worse. So the Great Depression was not just a financial crisis. It was a worldwide economic collapse that reshaped economies and societies across the globe. The effects of the Great Depression were widespread and went far beyond just economic statistics. They deeply affected everyday life and reshaped political systems around the world. One of the most immediate and visible effects was massive unemployment. In many countries, unemployment rates reached extremely high levels, leaving millions of people without stable income. Families struggled to afford basic necessities like food, housing, and clothing. In urban areas, this led to the growth of shantytowns, sometimes called Hoovervilles in the United States, where people lived in makeshift shelters. At the same time, farmers were also hit hard. Falling prices for agricultural goods meant that many farmers could not make enough money to survive, leading to foreclosures and loss of land. This combination of urban and rural hardship created a widespread sense of economic insecurity. But the effects were not only economic, they were also political. As governments struggled to respond effectively, many people began to lose faith in democratic systems. When traditional leaders seemed unable to fix the problem, people became more open to alternative solutions. This created opportunities for extremist political movements to gain support. Leaders who promised strong, decisive action, often with authoritarian approaches, began to appeal to populations that were desperate for stability and recovery. So the Great Depression didn't just create economic hardship, it also destabilized governments and helped create the conditions for major political changes around the world. At the beginning of the Great Depression, the United States government initially followed a laissez-faire approach, meaning there was very limited government involvement in the economy. The belief was that the market would eventually correct itself without direct intervention. However, as the crisis deepened, it became clear that this approach was not working. Banks were failing, businesses were closing, and unemployment continued to rise. Millions of Americans lost not only their jobs, but also their savings, creating widespread fear and uncertainty. The scale of the crisis forced a major reconsideration of the government's role in the economy. When Franklin D. Roosevelt became president in 1933, he introduced the New Deal, which marked a significant shift in policy. Instead of stepping back, the federal government took an active role in addressing the economic crisis. The New Deal focused on three main goals: relief, recovery, and reform. Relief programs provided immediate assistance to people who were struggling, including direct aid and job opportunities through public works projects. Recovery efforts aimed to restart economic growth by supporting industries and stabilizing the banking system. Reform programs were designed to prevent future crises by regulating financial institutions and creating safety nets. This shift is important because it represents a turning point in American economic policy. The government moved from limited involvement to playing a central role in managing the economy and supporting its citizens. The New Deal did more than introduce programs. It reflected a major shift in how people thought about the role of government in the economy. One of the key ideas connected to this shift is known as Keynesian economics, named after economist John Maynard Keynes. Keynes argued that during economic downturns, like the Great Depression, governments should actively intervene in the economy, rather than wait for it to recover on its own. His main idea was that when demand for goods and services drops, the government can step in by increasing spending to stimulate economic activity. This is exactly what we see in many New Deal programs. The government funded large public works projects, building roads, bridges, and dams, which created jobs and put money back into the hands of workers. As people began earning income again, they were able to spend more, which helped businesses recover. In addition to stimulating the economy, the government also introduced reforms to stabilize the financial system. For example, new regulations were put in place to prevent risky banking practices, and programs like Social Security provided long-term support for individuals. This represents a major departure from earlier economic policies. Instead of minimal involvement, the government became an active participant in managing economic stability. This shift is important because it helped shape modern economic policy and demonstrated how democratic governments could respond to crisis through reform, rather than turning to authoritarian control. After World War I, Italy faced serious economic and political challenges, even though it had been on the winning side of the war. Many Italians felt that their country had not received the territory or recognition it deserved, which created a sense of frustration and disappointment, often referred to as a, quote, mutilated victory. Economically, the war had been extremely costly. Italy was left with high levels of debt and inflation, which made it difficult for the government to stabilize the economy. At the same time, unemployment increased significantly, especially as soldiers returned home and struggled to find jobs in an already weakened economy. These economic problems affected both industry and agriculture. Factories faced disruptions in production, while farmers dealt with falling prices and reduced demand. As a result, many people across different social classes experienced economic hardship. This led to growing social unrest. Workers organized strikes, and in some cases, factories and land were occupied by labor groups demanding better conditions. At the same time, fear of socialism and communism increased among wealthier groups and business owners. Politically, Italy was unstable. Governments changed frequently, and there was little confidence in the ability of leaders to solve the country's problems. All of these factors, economic hardship, social unrest, and political instability, created an environment where many people began looking for strong leadership and decisive solutions, opening the door for the rise of extremist movements. Benito Mussolini rose to power in Italy by taking advantage of the economic instability, social unrest, and political weakness that developed after World War I. As conditions worsened, many Italians became frustrated with the government's inability to restore order or improve the economy. Mussolini positioned himself as a strong and decisive leader who could fix these problems. He promised to restore national pride, stabilize the economy, and bring order to a country that many people felt was falling apart. His message appealed to a wide range of groups, including veterans, business owners, and members of the middle class, who feared continued instability and the spread of socialism. To gain power, Mussolini relied not only on political messaging, but also on force. He organized paramilitary groups known as the Black Shirts, who used intimidation and violence to silence political opponents and break up labor movements. This helped create an atmosphere of fear that weakened opposition to his rise. In 1922, Mussolini and his supporters carried out the March on Rome, a demonstration of strength that pressured the Italian king to appoint him as prime minister. Once in power, Mussolini gradually dismantled democratic institutions and established a fascist dictatorship. Mussolini's rise is significant because it shows how economic hardship and political instability can lead people to support authoritarian leadership, especially when that leadership promises order, strength, and national revival. Fascism is a political ideology that developed in the early 20th century, most notably in Italy under Benito Mussolini. It is characterized by strong centralized authority, intense nationalism, and the limitation of individual freedoms in favor of the needs of the state. At its core, fascism emphasizes the idea that the nation is more important than the individual. Citizens are expected to show loyalty, obedience, and unity. while dissent and opposition are often suppressed. Political power is concentrated in the hands of a single leader or ruling group, rather than being shared through democratic institutions. Economically, fascism does not completely eliminate private property, but it does place the economy under strict government direction. Industries are often organized into groups or corporations that are expected to serve national goals, especially those related to military strength and economic self-sufficiency. Fascist governments also rely heavily on propaganda to shape public opinion and maintain control. They promote ideas of national pride, strength, and unity, while often targeting perceived enemies or outsiders as a way to unify the population. It's important to connect this back to what we just discussed. In Italy, fascism emerged as a response to economic hardship, social unrest, and political instability. For many people, the promise of order and stability made this system appealing, even though it came at the cost of political freedom and individual rights. This slide compares two different responses to economic crisis during the interwar period: the New Deal in the United States and fascism in Italy. At first glance, both systems involve increased government involvement in the economy, but the similarities mostly end there. In the United States, the New Deal operated within a democratic system. While the federal government expanded its role by creating jobs, regulating banks, and providing social support, it still preserved key democratic principles, such as elections, individual rights, and political opposition. The goal was to stabilize the economy, while maintaining a system based on participation and representation. In contrast, fascism in Italy involved a complete shift toward authoritarian control. Under Mussolini, the government not only directed the economy, but also eliminated political opposition, restricted freedoms, and centralized power in the hands of a single leader. Economic policies were designed to strengthen the state, often at the expense of individual rights. Both systems responded to economic crisis with more government involvement, but they reflect very different approaches. The New Deal represents reform within democracy, while fascism represents the replacement of democracy with authoritarian rule. This comparison is important because it shows that economic hardship does not lead to a single outcome. Instead, different societies can respond in very different ways, depending on their political structures and leadership. The Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 marked a major turning point in Russia's political and economic system, and provides another example of how instability can lead to dramatic change. Before the revolution, Russia was already facing serious challenges. The country was still largely agrarian, meaning most people were farmers, and industrial development was limited compared to other European nations. At the same time, the Russian monarchy, led by Tsar Nicholas II, struggled to respond effectively to economic problems and social unrest. World War I made these issues even worse. The war placed enormous strain on Russia's economy, leading to food shortages, inflation, and widespread suffering among both soldiers and civilians. As conditions deteriorated, confidence in the government collapsed. The Bolsheviks, a revolutionary socialist group led by Vladimir Lenin, capitalized on this dissatisfaction. They gained support by promising peace, land, and bread, which directly addressed the immediate needs of soldiers, workers, and peasants. In 1917, the Bolsheviks successfully overthrew the existing government and established a new political system based on communist principles. Their goal was to reorganize society and the economy so that resources would be controlled by the state and distributed more equally. This revolution is important because it represents a different kind of response to crisis. Instead of reforming the existing system, the Bolsheviks completely replaced it, creating a new model of government that would influence other countries in the years to come. The Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 marked a major turning point in Russia's political and economic system, and provides another example of how instability can lead to dramatic change. Before the revolution, Russia was already facing serious challenges. The country was still largely agrarian, meaning most people were farmers, and industrial development was limited compared to other European nations. At the same time, the Russian monarchy, led by Tsar Nicholas II, struggled to respond effectively to economic problems and social unrest. World War I made these issues even worse. The war placed enormous strain on Russia's economy, leading to food shortages, inflation, and widespread suffering among both soldiers and civilians. As conditions deteriorated, confidence in the government collapsed. The Bolsheviks, a revolutionary socialist group led by Vladimir Lenin, capitalized on this dissatisfaction. They gained support by promising peace, land, and bread, which directly addressed the immediate needs of soldiers, workers, and peasants. In 1917, the Bolsheviks successfully overthrew the existing government and established a new political system based on communist principles. Their goal was to reorganize society and the economy so that resources would be controlled by the state and distributed more equally. This revolution is important because it represents a different kind of response to crisis. Instead of reforming the existing system, the Bolsheviks completely replaced it, creating a new model of government that would influence other countries in the years to come. After Lenin's death, Joseph Stalin rose to power and dramatically changed the direction of the Soviet economy. Unlike Lenin, who had allowed some flexibility through the new economic policy, Stalin believed the Soviet Union needed rapid and total transformation in order to compete with industrialized nations and protect itself from potential threats. To achieve this, Stalin introduced a series of 5-year plans, which were centralized economic programs that set specific production goals for different sectors of the economy. These plans focused heavily on rapid industrialization, especially in areas like steel, coal, and machinery, which were considered essential for building a strong modern state. At the same time, Stalin implemented collectivization in agriculture. This policy forced individual farmers to give up their private land and join large, state-controlled farms known as collectives. The goal was to increase agricultural efficiency and allow the government to control food production more directly. While these policies did lead to significant increases in industrial output, they came at a very high human cost. Many peasants resisted collectivization, and the government responded with force. This led to widespread displacement, violence, and famine, particularly in regions like Ukraine. Stalin's approach demonstrates how a government can use strict control to rapidly reshape an economy, but it also highlights the severe consequences that can result from prioritizing production over human well-being. The economic policies implemented under Stalin, particularly the 5-year plans and collectivization, had significant consequences for the Soviet Union. These outcomes included both major industrial achievements and severe human costs. On one hand, the Soviet Union experienced rapid industrial growth. It transformed from a largely agricultural society into a major industrial power in a relatively short amount of time. Production of steel, coal, and machinery increased significantly, and the government invested heavily in building factories, infrastructure, and new industrial cities. This level of industrialization would later play an important role in strengthening the Soviet Union during World War II. However, these successes came at a very high cost. Collectivization disrupted agriculture, as peasants were forced to give up their land and join state-controlled farms. Many resisted, and the government responded harshly by seizing crops and punishing opposition. This contributed to widespread famine, particularly in Ukraine, where millions of people died. Now, looking closely at the propaganda poster on this slide, we can see how the Soviet government chose to represent these policies. The poster emphasizes themes of progress, unity, and strength. Workers and farmers are often shown as strong, productive, and optimistic, suggesting that industrialization and collectivization are benefiting the entire country. The imagery is designed to promote the idea that the Soviet Union is moving forward successfully under Stalin's leadership. It presents industrial growth as something positive and necessary, while ignoring or downplaying the suffering that many people were actually experiencing. This is important because it shows how propaganda can shape public perception. Even though the reality included famine, repression, and hardship, the government used visuals like this to maintain support and reinforce the idea that these policies were leading to progress. To wrap up this lesson, it's important to step back and look at the bigger picture of what we've covered about the global economy during the interwar period. First, the aftermath of World War I created significant economic instability, especially in countries like Germany. The Treaty of Versailles placed heavy financial burdens on Germany through reparations and territorial losses, which contributed to economic crises like hyperinflation and long-term instability. Second, the Great Depression showed how interconnected the global economy had become. What began as a financial crisis in the United States quickly spread around the world, leading to widespread unemployment, poverty, and economic collapse in many countries. Third, different nations responded to these economic challenges in different ways. In the United States, the New Deal expanded government involvement in the economy while maintaining democratic institutions. In contrast, countries like Italy turned toward authoritarian systems like fascism, while the Soviet Union used centralized economic planning under communism to rapidly industrialize. Finally, one of the most important takeaways is that economic instability does not just affect markets, it influences political systems and can lead to major global consequences. The economic struggles of the interwar period contributed to the rise of authoritarian leaders and increased global tensions, ultimately helping set the stage for World War II. Understanding these connections is key, because it shows how economic decisions and conditions can shape the course of history.